There's a school bus behind a chain-link fence on the edge of town. 4 flat tires, 1 window boarded over, the kind of thing you'd walk past without a second look. But climb inside and you'll find hardwood floors, a working kitchen, and string lighting along the ceiling. A man named Derrick Voss built every inch of it for $200, after he had almost nothing else. Less than a day after photos of it hit social media, a news van was parked outside asking to come in. To understand how a man with nothing built something that stunning, you have to go back to where it all started falling apart. Derrick wasn't always without a roof over his head. 3 years earlier, he was working full-time at a warehouse distribution center, renting a small 1-bedroom apartment, paying his bills on time every month. Nothing glamorous, but stable. He'd grown up bouncing between relatives after his mother passed when he was a teenager, so having a place that was entirely his own, even a modest apartment with second-hand furniture, meant more to him than most people would ever understand. He kept it clean. He hung pictures on the walls. He paid his rent the same day it hit his account every month, because he never wanted to give a landlord a reason to remind him it could all disappear. Then the warehouse cut his shift hours during a slow season, and 2 months later, cut him entirely. He applied to every job he could find: retail, construction, delivery driving. Nothing stuck long enough to cover rent. A short-term gig at a moving company fell through after 2 weeks when the company lost a contract. A retail interview turned into a rejection email the same afternoon. Each door that closed made the next one harder to walk through, because it's difficult to interview well when you're also calculating how many days of food money you have left. Within 4 months of losing that warehouse job, he was evicted from the apartment. His car got repossessed not long after that. The same week, he'd finally lined up an interview 2 towns over that he could no longer reach. And that's the part people underestimate about losing everything. It's rarely one disaster. It's a chain of small ones, each one making the next one worse, until the structure of an entire life collapses in under half a year. For the first stretch of homelessness, Derrick slept wherever he could, under an overpass near the interstate, on a bench outside a 24-hour laundromat that let him sit as long as he bought something from the vending machine, in a tent behind a strip mall until the property owner had it cleared out. He described that period later as the part where you stop thinking about the future and start thinking only about getting through the next 12 hours. Finding food, finding somewhere dry, staying safe. That kind of survival mode wears a person down in ways that are hard to see from the outside. But Derrick never stopped looking for a way out. The idea for the bus came almost by accident. Derrick was walking past a junkyard he passed most days, the kind of place with stacked car frames and rusted machinery behind a sagging fence, when he noticed an old school bus parked in the back corner that had clearly been sitting untouched for years. Weeds had grown up around the tires. The engine had long since been stripped for parts. He asked the owner about it out of curiosity more than anything, expecting to hear it wasn't for sale, or that it cost more than he could ever afford. Instead, the junkyard owner told him it was basically dead weight taking up space, and he'd sell it for $200 just to get it off the lot. $200 was almost everything Derrick had. He'd been saving loose change and small amounts from odd jobs, cash he'd been putting toward a bus ticket to a city where he'd heard shelters had more openings. Spending it all on a broken-down bus with no engine and a rotted interior felt, on paper, like a terrible decision. But Derrick looked at that bus and saw something other people walking past it never would. He saw 4 solid walls, a roof that, with some patching, could keep out the rain, enough square footage to actually live in, not just survive in. He handed over the cash that same afternoon. The people who knew him on the street thought he'd lost his mind. Why would you sink your only money into a vehicle that doesn't run, sitting in a junkyard, when that same money could get you a bus ticket somewhere with actual services? One man who'd been living out of a shopping cart nearby told him straight up he was wasting his last chance. A woman who ran a small mutual aid group that handed out sandwiches near the underpass warned him that junkyard owners change their minds all the time, and he could end up losing both the money and the bus in the same week if the owner decided to sell the whole lot to a scrapper. But nobody in that conversation was factoring in the one thing that actually mattered. A shelter bed disappears the second you walk out the door for the day. A bus, even a dead one, is still yours tomorrow. Derrick admitted later there were nights in that first week, sitting alone in the gutted shell of the bus with no power, no water, and a hole in the roof he hadn't patched yet, when he wondered if everyone else had been right. The bus smelled like mildew and rusted metal. Rain came through the roof, onto the same square foot of floor every single night, no matter how he angled the tarp he'd draped over it. He caught himself, more than once, walking back toward the underpass out of habit, before remembering he technically had somewhere else to sleep now. But he kept coming back to that one thought about the shelter bed. This, whatever it became, could actually be his. The first month was almost entirely demolition and cleanup. Derrick ripped out the rotted school bus seating, most of it by hand, because he couldn't afford tools, and hauled it out piece by piece to a dumpster 3 blocks away. He scraped out years of grime, dead leaves, and animal nests from the wheel wells and undercarriage. He learned, mostly through trial and error on a library computer, how to patch a leaking roof using tar paper and scrap sheet metal pulled from a construction site dumpster. Every material in that bus, in the beginning, came from somewhere free. Curbside furniture piles on trash night, leftover lumber from a home renovation crew that let him take their scraps, a church donation bin that gave him a stack of old blankets and a working space heater. The turning point came when a hardware store employee named Ruth started noticing him picking through the discount and damaged goods bin outside the store every few days. Instead of running him off, Ruth started setting aside things that were too damaged to sell, but still usable. Cracked tile with chips on one edge, a dented stainless steel sink, paint cans with just enough left in them to finish a small room. That single relationship changed the entire trajectory of the build, and it's worth sitting with for a second. It wasn't a grant or a program or a nonprofit. It was one employee deciding a guy going through the damaged bin deserved better than getting told to move along. He taught himself basic electrical work by watching videos on that same library computer, running a simple 12-volt system off a deep cycle battery he found for cheap, charged by a small solar panel mounted on the bus roof. It wasn't much, enough for a few LED lights and to charge a phone an outreach worker had given him. But after months of living in total darkness once the sun went down, that small string of warm white lights along the ceiling felt like the difference between surviving and actually living somewhere. An outreach worker named Angela Reyes, who checked the junkyard lot roughly once a week as part of her rounds, became another quiet piece of the story. She wasn't there to hand him money or materials. Mostly she just showed up, asked how the build was going, and occasionally connected him with a caseworker who could help with things like a replacement ID or a bus pass to get to job interviews. Derrick has said that having one person show up consistently, even just to talk for 10 minutes, mattered almost as much as any of the physical materials that went into the bus. Outreach workers will tell you this pattern more than people expect. It's rarely a program that pulls someone out of homelessness for good. It's one person who keeps showing up on schedule, whether or not anything is happening that week. The build wasn't a straight line upward. A late spring storm tore off a section of the roof patch Derrick had spent 2 weeks perfecting, flooding half the interior and ruining a stack of reclaimed flooring he'd been collecting for months. He had to start that section over from nothing. Around the same time, someone broke in one night while he was out collecting cans for recycling money and stole the small propane camp stove that was, at that point, his only way to cook food. And more than once, city officials threatened to have the bus towed off the junkyard property, forcing Derrick into tense conversations with the owner to convince him to let it stay a little longer. Despite all of it, Derrick kept building. Slowly, room by room, The inside of that bus stopped looking like the shell of an old-school vehicle and started looking like an actual small home. He built a raised sleeping platform toward the back, using salvaged pallet wood, sanded down and stained with a mix of coffee grounds and vinegar, because he couldn't afford real wood stain. Underneath it, he built storage drawers on old drawer slides pulled from a discarded dresser. He framed out a narrow kitchenette along one wall with the dented stainless steel sink Ruth had given him. Hooked up to a 5-gallon water jug system, he refilled at a public spigot a few blocks away. The countertop became a section of butcher block that had been sitting damaged in the hardware store's clearance pile for months, waiting for someone who didn't mind a few surface scratches. Derrick sanded it smooth himself and sealed it with food-safe mineral oil. He hung a small mirror above the sink that he'd found leaning against a dumpster, framed it with thin strips of leftover trim wood, and it became, in his words, the first mirror he'd looked into in over a year that made him feel like a person with a home rather than someone just trying to disappear. The floors were the project he was proudest of. He collected mismatched hardwood flooring samples a flooring store was throwing out because they were discontinued colors, not enough of any single one to cover a whole room. Instead of treating that as a problem, Derrick arranged them in a deliberate patchwork pattern across the bus floor, different wood tones fitted together like a puzzle. What started as a compromise born out of necessity ended up looking intentional, almost designer, and the darker tones near the door weren't just for looks either. They hide dirt tracked in far better than a single pale finish ever would. That's the detail that separates someone scraping by from someone actually thinking like a builder. By late in the build, the bus had curtains sewn from donated fabric, a small shelf of second-hand books, a folding table that doubled as a desk, and that string of warm lighting running the length of the ceiling that switched on every night at dusk. He'd also built a narrow bench seat near the front windshield, cushioned with foam padding, salvaged from an old couch left on the curb, giving him a spot to sit with morning coffee and actually watch the sun come up, instead of just enduring another day. It had gone from an abandoned shell rotting behind a junkyard fence to something that, if you stepped inside without knowing the story, you might mistake for a stylish, intentional tiny home build featured on a renovation show. Word about the bus started spreading, the way these things usually do now. Someone from the outreach program took a few photos inside, mostly just to show a caseworker how far Derrick had come, and shared them in a local community group online asking for donations to help him finish the last few details. Those photos got shared again and again. Within a couple of days, they'd made their way well outside the original group, landing in front of people who couldn't believe what they were looking at came from $200 and a year of scavenging. The morning after those photos really started taking off, a car pulled up outside the junkyard fence that wasn't from the outreach program or the hardware store. It was a local news van, camera equipment and all, with a reporter who'd seen the photos in a group chat and convinced her producer it was worth a same-day trip to see if the story was real. Derrick was in the middle of sanding a shelf when he heard gravel crunching under tires and looked up to see a reporter and a cameraman climbing out, asking if this was the bus from the photos. He said his first instinct was embarrassment, worried they'd come to film the rundown junkyard lot rather than what he'd actually built inside it. But the moment the reporter stepped through the door and saw the patchwork hardwood floor, the warm lighting, the hand-built storage, and the little mirror above the sink, her reaction told him everything he needed to know. She stood in the doorway for a few seconds without saying anything at all. The interview that followed wasn't long, maybe 10 minutes of Derrick walking the crew through each part of the bus and explaining where every material had come from. The dumpster runs, Ruth and the damaged goods bin. The nights he wondered if spending that $200 had been the biggest mistake of his life. He wasn't polished on camera. He stumbled over a few sentences and had to stop once to collect himself when the reporter asked what the space meant to him. He said the hardest part wasn't the physical work at all. It was a year of people assuming just by looking at him, that he'd stopped trying. The segment ran that evening as the station's lead human interest story and got picked up online almost immediately. Comment sections filled within hours, some viewers offering to send tools or money directly, others saying the floor pattern alone belonged in a design magazine. A few skeptics assumed the whole thing had to be staged, that no one could build something that clean with scraps and $200, until a longer follow-up segment showed his old photos of the gutted shell alongside the finished build, with Angela confirming on camera she'd watched the whole process happen week by week. In the days after the story ran, things shifted for Derrick fast. A local contractor reached out offering him part-time work, having watched the segment and been impressed by the electrical and carpentry skills Derrick had essentially taught himself. A handful of viewers mailed him real tools, the kind he'd never been able to afford, along with small cash donations he used to finally fix the bus's engine so it could actually be driven instead of sitting fixed in place. The property owner, the same man who'd once threatened to have it towed, ended up offering to let Derrick park there rent-free permanently, telling the news crew he'd rather have someone taking care of the space than let it sit empty and rotting the way it had for years. A few weeks later, the station invited Derrick back for a short follow-up, this time to show off the engine repair funded by viewer donations and a fresh coat of exterior paint. He drove the bus under its own power for the first time in over a year, just a slow loop around the junkyard lot with the reporter riding along. He said hearing the engine turn over felt almost as good as finishing the interior. It meant the bus wasn't only a place to live anymore, it was something that could take him somewhere, if he ever wanted it to. Derrick still lives in that bus today, though it looks a little different now with the small upgrades that came after the story spread. What hasn't changed is the reason he built it the way he did in the first place. He didn't build something beautiful because he expected anyone to notice. He built it because after losing his job, his apartment, and his car in under 6 months, the one thing nobody could take from him was his standards for how he wanted to live. $200 and a year of scavenging, sanding, and refusing to give up turned an abandoned bus nobody else wanted into proof that dignity was never about how much money you have. It was always about what you're willing to build with what's left.